Today we're going to look at the Italian Renaissance and some of the popes during that period. Since popes are elected, most of them are not related to each other, and as Catholic priests they generally do not have any children, and therefore making a family tree of popes is not really possible. But the Italian Renaissance was an exceptional time. During the Renaissance there were several popes who were related to each other, and in fact there were several that even had children. Three families pretty much dominated the papacy during the Renaissance period. There were the Borgias, shown here in green, the della Roveres, shown in blue, and the Medicis, shown in red. Let's start in the year 1400. This was the height of the Western Schism, a period of conflict within the Catholic Church in which there were two rival popes at the same time, and then eventually three popes at the same time. In addition to the Pope at Rome, there was also a Pope at Avignon in France, and another one in Pisa, Italy. Eventually a special council was convened, and the problems were worked out. And this is generally considered to be the beginning of the Renaissance Papacy. The first pope that we're going to look at is Pope Calixtus III, who was Spanish and was elected pope in 1455. His real name was Alfonso de Borgia, and he is the start of the Borgia family's rise to prominence. He had a sister named Isabella, and that sister had a son named Rodrigo, so Rodrigo was his nephew. At the time, it was common for a pope to appoint at least one of his nephews to be a cardinal, and Pope Calixtus III did this for Rodrigo. This is where the word nepotism comes from. Nepotismo is the Italian word for nephew. And nowadays, the word nepotism is used whenever a person gets a job because one of their relatives helps them out. We'll get back to Rodrigo in a moment. Another thing Pope Calixtus did was that he exonerated Joan of Arc. Now, Joan of Arc had already been burned at the stake 35 years earlier, so it was a little late. But basically, they had a retrial and determined that she was innocent. In fact, later the Catholic Church made her a saint. The next pope we're going to look at is Pope Sixtus IV from the della Rovere family from Italy. He was elected pope in 1471. He's the one who commissioned the Sistine Chapel to be built, and therefore this famous building is named after him. Sistine meaning belonging to Sixtus. He also approved the Spanish Inquisition, which of course nobody expected. While he was pope, he appointed his nephew, Giuliano, as cardinal. In 1492, Rodrigo de Borgia, who as we already mentioned was the nephew of a previous pope, Pope Calixtus III, was himself elected pope. He took the name Alexander VI, and he was perhaps the most controversial pope of all time. Because of him, the Borgia family became associated with wild sex parties, bribery, and even murder. He had a long-time mistress with whom he had 4 children. He likely had more children, but these are the 4 that he freely admitted to being the father of. Giovanni, or Juan in Spanish, is thought to have been the eldest, and he unfortunately is best remembered for having been murdered. It was suspected that one of his brothers did the deed. But he had a grandson who became one of the early leaders of the Jesuits, and who was also later made a saint. Caesar is perhaps the most famous of the Borgia children. He was originally made a cardinal, but after the death of his brother, he resigned that post, and his father made him a prince instead, giving him various lands in Italy. It is thought that the famous writer Niccolo Machiavelli based his well-known book, The Prince, on Caesar Borgia. Lucrezia married 3 times, each time to a member of an important Renaissance family. Her first husband was from the House of Sforza, which ruled Milan. Her second husband was from the House of Aragon in Spain. And her third husband was from the House of Este from Ferrara. There were a lot of rumors about Lucrezia during her lifetime. She was suspected of being a secret murderer, having a hollow ring that she used to poison drinks. Many of these Borgias are characters in the video game Assassin's Creed. Now back to the popes. Pope Alexander VI was followed by Pius III, but Pope Pius III died just 27 days into his papacy, and therefore another election was held, and Giuliano della Rovere, nephew to Pope Sixtus IV, was chosen. He became Pope Julius II. He had a daughter through one of his mistresses, and that daughter's name was Felice. She was a well-educated, powerful woman during the Renaissance with connections to many noble families. Pope Julius was a major patron of the arts. He's the person who commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He also commissioned Raphael to paint his most famous piece. Pope Julius II was followed by Pope Leo X, the first pope from the Medici family. The Medici family is perhaps the most important family of all when it comes to the Italian Renaissance, so let's look at them in greater detail. The family rose to prominence in Florence with Giovanni de' Medici, who founded the Medici Bank. But the business really took off under his eldest son, Cosimo de' Medici. In fact, he was so successful that he and his descendants became the de facto rulers or lords of Florence. He was followed by his son, Piero the Gouty, and then Piero's son, Lorenzo. Lorenzo is known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, and he is perhaps the most famous of all the Medicis. He was a big patron of the arts and helped the Renaissance to reach its highest point. But about halfway through his rule, there was a conspiracy approved by Pope Sixtus to have Lorenzo killed. In the attack led by the Pazzi family, Lorenzo's brother Giuliano died, but Lorenzo himself was able to escape. The Medicis had a better relationship with the next pope, Pope Innocent VIII. Innocent was another pope to have had a child. In fact, Lorenzo arranged for one of his daughters to marry that child, and in exchange, the Pope made one of Lorenzo's sons, who was named Giovanni, a cardinal. And this is how he ended up in a position to later become the Pope. You'll notice that there were 2 branches of the family, a senior branch and a junior branch. These 2 were members of the junior branch, but their father died when they were young, and they ended up living with Lorenzo. So he had 5 of his own children, these 4, and then the one that became the Pope later, plus these 2 adopted children. Lorenzo's line continued through his eldest son, Piero, who was known as Piero the Unfortunate, and then through Piero's son, Lorenzo II. Lorenzo II had a daughter who went on to become Queen of France, marrying King Henry II of France, and she was also the mother of 3 different kings of France. So you can see that although the Medicis were not royals themselves, they were powerful enough to basically be considered the equal of royalty. Let's go back to the popes for a second. So Pope Leo X was the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and it was during his time as Pope that Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door, sparking the Protestant Reformation. And it was Pope Leo X who had Luther excommunicated, basically kicked out of the Catholic Church. But the blame for the Protestant Reformation can also be given to these 2 previous popes as well, because it was during their reigns that indulgences became a big problem. Indulgences were a way for rich people to pay the Catholic Church in exchange for getting forgiveness for sins and other benefits. A few short years after Pope Leo X, another Medici was elected pope. These two individuals were first cousins. Leo, of course, was the son of Lorenzo the Medici, and Clement VII was the son of his brother, the individual who was killed during the Papacy conspiracy. It was Pope Clement VII who was pope during the time that King Henry VIII wanted to divorce his first wife. Clement forbade that divorce, and King Henry ended up starting the Church of England in response, further strengthening the Protestant Reformation. During the reign of Pope Clement VII, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was also Charles I of Spain, took over the city of Rome, and this point is usually considered to be the end of the Renaissance Papacy, and after this we are in the Reformation. A few more quick points about the Medici family. After Lorenzo II, the line continued with his son Alessandro, and Alessandro became the first official Duke of Florence, but he was assassinated by a relative. And because of this, the line then passed to this individual here, who was the grandson of Lucrezia de' Medici, but also a direct male line descendant of the junior branch of the family. He was the second Duke of Florence, but then he was raised to become a Grand Duke, and he's called the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Tuscany being the region around Florence. And from this point on, the Medicis were Grand Dukes of Tuscany for quite some time. First, Cosimo I's eldest son, then his younger son, and then the line goes through him all the way to 1737. And I'll point out that Grand Duke Francesco I had a daughter who was another Queen Consort of France. She married Henry IV, King of France. So to sum up, this 100-year period from the end of the Western Schism to the Protestant Reformation was probably the time when the papacy reached its peak of political power. And it was really these three families that made that happen. This period also coincided with the High Renaissance, when some of the world's greatest works of art were created in Florence, Rome, and other parts of Italy. And of course, the Italian Renaissance sparked the Renaissance to occur all over Europe, and this ended up laying the foundation for the modern world. Now, this particular chart is not yet available as a poster. It's still kind of under construction, but I hope to expand it further and make it available at some point in the future. You can check my website, usefulcharts.com, or follow me on Twitter to get the latest info. Thanks for watching.